Third. Welcome to Third Phase of Moon. My name's Blake Cousins. Now get ready for the start of an amazing journey. The largest YouTube channel is now on the largest civilian-run radio station, Third Phase of Moon Radio with researchers on a mission. Host Dr. J. Andy Elias and best-selling author, MUFON investigator Preston Dennett are about to take you on all the rides of our lives. We'll be taking UFO news, interviewing top researchers. The journey begins now. Third Phase of Moon Radio is officially on air. Without further ado, here comes Third Phase of Moon, researchers on a mission.
We welcome you back to Third Phase of Moon Radio. I'm your host, Dr. J, and we have an incredible show for you today. Professor Ted Peters, so much under his belt. He has been a professor in theology. He coined the term astrotheology, which is a big topic, which we're going to be speaking to in a moment. He's a MUFON director, state MUFON director of Louisiana. And, of course, you know, he has written several books, I think over 24. The most recent, which we're speaking about today, is UFOs, God's Chariots. And one other thing I'd like to add in there, he has been a consultant to NASA. Professor Peters, welcome to the show, and how are you doing this evening?
Dr. J, it's nice to be in the third phase of the moon.
Well, it's a pleasure is all ours. You know, I think you touched on a very, very important topic. If we go back to when Eisenhower first met with the ETs in 1954, apparently when he formed the Grenada Treaty, he told them that the world is not quite ready for their presence. And he said apparently there was supposed to be a 50-year plan to acclimate us to them, which obviously has been more than 50 years. One of the reasons he stated was that we would have social upheaval and rioting like they did in 38 or 36 whenever the War of the Worlds broadcast from Orson Welles played. And one of the things they said is, aside from society and economic impacts, there are religious impacts. Well, I think now people are less inclined to have religion being the preface to prevent them from believing in UFOs, which is why I'm really glad you brought this topic of astrotheology. Now, you've been paying attention to what the Vatican's been saying recently, right?
I have, yes.
So you are very familiar that they have changed everything from instead of using the word world anymore, now they use the word universe. They were asked if one of the, I don't remember what of the cardinals' names is, but he said if he was asked to baptize an alien, would he? And he said yes. If he was asked, he would. And then, of course, there's, you know, Cardinal or Monsignor Balducci, who was very open about this. And when Pope John Paul was the Pope, John Paul II, every time Balducci was on, he made sure that he was watching him or listening to him, regardless of what his schedule was. Well, recently, one of the final things that they did is they said that a lot of people said, well, how can we believe in extraterrestrials? Didn't Jesus die on the cross for mankind, and therefore these things cannot exist? They went ahead and said that no, Jesus died on the cross for humans, so that doesn't necessarily apply to our space brothers. And I thought that was, bam, the biggest moment. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that, because what do you see progressing with not just Catholicism with over 1 billion people, but Christianity as a whole? Because I was born Greek Orthodox, and obviously it was very taboo to speak of UFOs, but the moment the Pope announces it, I think everybody, you know, there's going to be no Christian religion that's going to battle it. Well, so what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I've got a lot to say about that, but let's talk first maybe about the Vatican here. You're right that in recent years with Cardinal Balducci and Popes John Paul II and now Francis I, that we see an openness to this question about extraterrestrial life. I think what startled a lot of people was just a week ago in a sermon that Pope Francis I delivered, he mentioned the possibility of extraterrestrials disembarking on Earth from a spaceship. And he said, would we baptize them? And he says, well, if they ask for it, we'll baptize them. And Guy Consolmagno, Jesuit brother with the Vatican Observatory, has spoken at greater length about this, and Roman Catholics have a strong defense of free will. And so Brother Guy says if they freely ask for baptism, well, of course, how could we deny it? And that's part of Francis I's mission. He wants to broaden the imagination of the Roman Catholic Church these days, to be more inclusive. Remember, about a year ago, he said that Catholics could cooperate with atheists and agnostics of goodwill on social justice issues. So in some ways, his bringing up the subject of aliens is part of that sort of broadening message. And one final thing about the Vatican, it's important to know that the Vatican has its own observatory that's been technically in existence for about 3 or 4 centuries. And since the Second World War, they've been pursuing a lot of scientific research having to do with galaxy formation and related matters. And, of course, they take up the question of extraterrestrial life, exoplanets, and the possibility that there might be intelligent life. And let me just say, it's an everyday thing for them to think about ETI. So the bottom line is, really for decades now, the Vatican certainly has been at home with the prospect that intelligent creatures exist elsewhere in space. And these sort of cute public discussions about baptism, it's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more going on there, I think, than just a question, should we baptize them or not?
Oh, I completely agree. I think, like you said, the cute little question on baptism really probably had no implication on baptism whatsoever. I think really the core of the question was, are they willing to accept extraterrestrials? And they just wanted to guise it up in a different way. Now, UFOs have been taboo 20, 30 years ago, 10 years ago. They started becoming less taboo. For instance, now, when we see a documentary on UFOs on TV, Ancient Aliens or any one of those shows, you see the whole hour on them showing evidence, where 20 years ago, if you were watching any documentary on UFOs, or even on Larry King when he had Stanton Friedman, or Apollo 14 astronaut Edgar Mitchell, the people, they would have a skeptic that would debunk them for an equal amount of time. So things are definitely progressing. But you being a theologian and a professor of theology for so many years, decades for that matter, what was your own path to get into UFOs in the face of all this? Because I'm sure it was taboo for you, in your profession to be talking about this and dealing with this.
Yeah, let me say something about what you brought up with regard to the scientific investigation. Stan Friedman, whom you mentioned, really presents himself as a serious UFO investigator employing a scientific method for analyzing data. And I would suggest that at least for MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, and for others too in ufology, this has been their concern really all along. I don't think this concern for careful evidence gathering and tendering hypotheses about UFOs and turning UFOs into IFOs, identified flight objects, has really been around for a long time. Part of the problem is the media. In the 1950s, the media decided that the world is made up of 2 groups: those who believe in UFOs and those who are skeptics that debunk UFOs, and they couldn't report anything in the news unless they got a believer and a debunker, and which meant that for decades there was never any news, right? It was always the same story. They just changed the Indians. And it's difficult then, if you're in the UFO community, to see the complexity and the nuance and the variety. The media just cannot get clear on this for the very reason that you gave, Dr. J, namely, all they could think of is a believer and a debunker. And what we're seeing these days on History 2, I gather that you like to watch that channel. I know I sure do. Are shows, documentaries about big history and ancient aliens and the MUFON series. And I think these are fascinating. You don't have to agree with everything that you see, but they really are prompting our imaginations to think about these things, and they don't always have a debunker for a believer or a believer for a debunker. They're able to just kind of like deal with the subject matter in an exciting kind of way.
Definitely agreed. And I think obviously for that reason times are changing. Now I want to get back to, we're going to be coming to a break shortly, so I know if this interrupts, obviously we're going to be carrying it over. But your history as a theologian, I'm sure, as I mentioned earlier, you probably dealt with a lot of adversity talking about this subject.
Oh, I have, and I started with my interest in UFOs and actually the question of extraterrestrial life when I was maybe 11 or 12 years old. So I've had this curiosity long before I became a theologian, and I gave it up for a few years, but eventually that curiosity came back, and so I've tried to find a way to put together my role as a Lutheran pastor and as a theologian with my interest in outer space. I think of myself as having outer space in my inner soul, and the real excitement about UFOs is the extraterrestrial hypothesis. If it turns out that UFOs are only a product of people's imaginations, I'm going to be kind of disappointed because I hope someday they do land and I get to shake their hand.
I think we all do, and that brings us to our first break. Perfect timing. Everybody stay tuned. Third Phase of the Moon Radio will be right back. Welcome back to Third Phase of the Moon Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Jake. Special co-host today, special guest co-host, of course, is Madison. And we are speaking to Professor Ted Peters, who is so much more than a professor. And right before break, he actually said something really important, that one day you would like to meet them. I would love open contact for them to land and get out of their ships and come to us and shake hands or do whatever they do in their culture. But let's just jump into this really important question, which will lead up to everything. Do you think that these visitors from space, or ancient astronauts, as I like to call them, and so do you and several other people, are responsible for jump-starting the human evolution and advancing our civilization on Earth?
Actually, I probably don't. I think there are two questions here. The first one is, would ancient aliens have jump-started our biological evolution? And then the second question would be, somewhere in the 3rd or 4th millennium BC, did they have an influence on the leap in the history of civilization, on the architecture of the Egyptian pyramids and related matters? And on the first one, let me just say that I think we're getting more and more DNA evidence about the evolutionary history of Homo sapiens and related ancestors. And there is so much continuity, there isn't really much room in that data to locate what we could call alien DNA. Nevertheless, there's no question that your and my Homo sapien ancestors marked a tremendous leap over those that preceded us in evolutionary history, and there is no really good explanation for that. And so I don't want to say that the extraterrestrial hypothesis is wrong. I just want to say that right now the evidence for that is probably not as strong as some ancient astronaut theorists would like to think. When it comes to the question of jump-starting our civilization, did celestial engineers help the Egyptians build the pyramids, for example? I tend to think, again, that was a natural evolution. The instructions on how to build the pyramids are written right in the pyramids. We even know the history of the architects and how the labor was handled and all of that kind of thing. That doesn't reduce the majesty of these accomplishments somewhere after 3,000 or so before the Common Era. But I don't think it took alien technology to make that possible. I have a couple of items that I like to raise with ancient astronaut theorists. The first one is the wheel. If you notice that we've got pyramids in Sumer and Akkad, we've got pyramids in Egypt, we've got pyramids in Mesoamerica. They're not from the same time, but, you know, they're within 1,000 years or two of each other. And so one could say, well, okay, the aliens went around the world instructing people on how to build pyramids. But the problem I have is that the Sumerians and the Egyptians had the wheel. We know that because they have pictures of wheels, and they use them on chariots, and they use them for carting heavy materials, etc., behind horses. So we know that they had the wheel. But when you get to Mesoamerica, Mexico, and places like that, and you look at the Olmecs and the Mayans and the Toltecs and the Aztecs, they did not have the wheel. When the Europeans arrived, they found the Aztecs transporting things by basically a stretcher that they would drag along the ground. And it seems to me that if the aliens were visiting many parts of the planet, why would they give the wheel, you know, to one group and not to another? My dad was an automotive engineer, and I was running this theory by him one time, and he says, well, it's not such a big deal to invent the first wheel. The really smart person was the guy who invented the other three. Well, that's the way the engineers think. So at any rate, Dr. J, I'd like to know what you think about my little hypothesis there, and do you think that that we really can speak about the rise of civil society and their architectural achievements as jump-started by alien engineers?
I actually absolutely agree that we have been jump-started by them. And going back to the physical aspect, actually Bob Lazar, when he worked at S4, I truly believe Bob Lazar's story. He's never once wavered from it. He doesn't want, he won't speak about it. He said it's ruined his life. He's never once, you know, made a movie, made a book. He doesn't want anything to do with it. He just told the truth like it was. And one of the things he said was in his briefings that he was shown while at S4, that we were corrected externally by these ETs between 63 and 65 times. I thought it was 63 times, but when we had John Lear on a couple weeks ago, he said 65. That's why I say there's the dichotomy between the two. I definitely believe that's the case, that they came here with whatever was on the species on the planet. I think it was Neanderthal at the time. They took the DNA that they had from maybe it was a conglomerate of other species and merged it together and slowly but surely created Homo sapien. And as they're continuing to add these changes, Dr. Lear, sadly, who passed away recently, coined another term, Homo nueticus, where maybe this next correction that's been going on through these abductions with all these millions of people on Earth is creating that next step. So maybe if it's 63 corrections, this is the 64th, or if it's 65, this is the 66th. So with the physical aspect, I definitely agree with you there. With the wisdom, I too agree with you there. I wasn't aware that they didn't spread certain things such as the wheel. That makes sense, sure. I love what your father said. You know, the real smart person was the guy who decided to put the other three together. But when you look at the pyramids, you have all these individual places that had no contact with each other. They were separated by oceans apart, and yet they were all creating the same thing. Now, is this because it was all part of human consciousness, and this was just, you know, the global consciousness that we all tapped into, and that's what man created? Or, like they all talk about, giving wisdom from their space brothers. Each one of these civilizations, from the Egyptians to the Greeks to the Romans to the Mayans to the Aztecs to the American Indians, all of them talk about getting these wisdom from the sky, wisdom from angels, wisdom from space brothers, and so many other things. So I definitely agree with your hypothesis on both points.
Yes, well, you're right that the cultures of these various peoples include a relationship between earth and sky. We know that the myths of creation in ancient Sumer, Akkad, Babylonia, etc., has a marriage between earth and sky, and that's why they built their version of the pyramid, the ziggurat, which is kind of like a tower. And certainly you see that in the Mayans, etc. And then you get these stories of the shamans who, in a dream state, will actually fly to the heavens. Usually the story will include riding on the back of a bird, hence feather symbolism with shamans. And then in the sky, they get the knowledge, the esoteric knowledge of healing, which they bring back to Earth, and this gives them then their special role in their respective societies. And that appears in many, many cultures without any cross-cultural influence. I think that's an important datum, and I can see it's plausible that the ancient astronaut hypothesis would have an explanation for that. Let me just say I find that reasonable, and so I don't dismiss that. Yet at the same time, I recognize that these ancient myths and stories are symbolic speech. They're not necessarily literal. And but that's about as far as I can get. I just want to say the ancient astronaut theory or hypothesis is probably as good as any other explanation, even though I'm not persuaded that it is the only explanation.
I agree with you there. You know, Occam's razor, the most reasonable explanation, or the best explanation is the most reasonable explanation. And when you have so many unknowns in this, and you look at history collectively, like we were saying with the physical and the wisdom for over those thousands and thousands of years, I think that using Occam's razor, my theory that has come down to is that it's the ancient astronaut theory. That's what I've concluded to. Nonetheless, our co-host, Madison, has a burning question for you, and she's been idly listening for this fascinating question.
Well, I want to hear Madison's question.
Let's go for it. Madison?
Hello, Ted. Thank
Hi.
you for sharing with us your information. I'm wondering if you had any personal experience or information on a connection of beings that are figures in the outer Earth and the network inside the Earth?
The outer Earth and the inside the planet. By outer Earth, you mean at one of the 7 levels? Actually, I don't. I usually think of those various astral levels as spiritual levels and not necessarily physical levels, even though there are some groups that I've studied who will place orbiting UFOs on those various levels. I will have to say that I've never fully comprehended or understood that, and I don't give much credibility to the hollow Earth theory, if that's what you're suggesting, Madison, that there might be a race of individuals within the Earth that come out from time to time. Let me just say those are two areas that I haven't really looked into very much. And what do you think? If you ask the question, I'll bet you have an opinion.
I'm just totally curious about it. I haven't had any personal experience, but I've heard about it, so I like to get people's opinions on the matter because I think everything's fascinating regardless. And if there is, I know that there's talk about Aboriginals and they have, areas that are within the Earth. I don't know how far in, but that hold a lot of secrets to our history. and our evolution and our communication with beings from the stars. So,
let's not forget Admiral Byrd, his expedition following World War II, which took him to Antarctica with literally an armada of Navy ships and airplanes. And apparently they went into this crater which took them into this hollow earth, and they were chased out by these high-flying discs, flying saucers, for lack of a better term. I think that's the exact term he used.
Mm-hmm.
So, on some level, is that a base for them? Is that where they're monitoring us? I've always wondered that at that, for that given point. Is it connected? Is it them? Is the people living underneath us, is it the same people that are coming from the stars, is one of the big things that I've always pondered. But nonetheless, you've worked with NASA, right? And on the face, NASA and SETI scientists really dismiss this. They mock ufology. And I wanted to ask you, by working with them, do you think that they actually believe in UFOs deep inside, and they're just giving us this facade that they don't?
Well, I'll give you a little background and then a foreground. On the background, what NASA scientists and those scientists in other space agencies around the world need to do over the next half decade is to work on the ethics of space exploration. Questions such as, if we go to Mars or to Titan, which is a moon of Saturn, should we contaminate the environment, for example, or do we have a moral obligation to protect biospheres that are off Earth? And to date, there's really not much in the way of existing policy. And so my role has been, as a philosopher, to help NASA scientists and others to think through these ethical issues. So that's basically my contact with them. But I will then, to get back to your question, I will observe that by and large, scientists at NASA and SETI are not sympathetic with the UFO movement. They love science fiction. Almost every space researcher I have talked to is inspired by science fiction, but they're almost deaf on UFOs. And if you say, well, what's your problem with UFOs? And they'll say, well, there's not any evidence. Well, what they mean by that, if you inquire a little bit, is that the evidence that we're being visited by extraterrestrials and UFOs, the evidence is anecdotal in character. It's stories told by witnesses. And what most empirical scientists want is the kind of data that can be repeated in experiments. And so what we might consider to be good evidence for extraterrestrial visitation and the UFO phenomenon doesn't count in their calculus. They don't know there's no box in the cash register for dropping it in. And so they tend really not to like UFO people. However, we mentioned MUFON earlier, the Mutual UFO Network, with whom I've had a long relationship. These people, for the most part, I call them nuts and bolts ufologists. The nuts and bolts ufologists really think scientifically too, and many of their leaders have doctorates in one or another natural science, and they too want to gather evidence and evaluate it very carefully and objectively and not jump to conclusions. So there really is a scientific mindset at work amongst ufologists that I think deserves a great deal of respect. So the way I put it is that on the 4th of July, the SETI and NASA people will gather for their barbecue and the ufologists will gather for their barbecue, but they don't invite each other. I think maybe it's about time they gave each other an invitation.
Definitely agreed there. What's it going to take for them to actually do it? What do they need? What are they waiting for them to finally merge the two and stop ridiculing ufologists, as far as the scientists and the SETI people? What do you think what do they require? I know they're asking for tangible physical proof, but there have been some things that have been suggested, such as the Atacama humanoid, which is an anomaly in itself. Chimpanzees, the closest thing to humans, have 98% DNA. Well, this humanoid, which the doctor who wrote the textbook on deformities in babies and fetuses basically proved that this is not a deformed human. And on top of that, the percentage of human DNA in it is 92%. What can account for such a big difference? That alone is one of the things. And then, of course, there's this piece of metal that Linda Moulton Howe has, and then we have these implants that Dr. Roger Lear pulled out of people. These are physical, tangible things that the scientific community doesn't really take a good look at, and that's always boggled my mind. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think that the kinds of things that you have just raised do fit the category of the kind of evidence that should be examined and respected and considered. I myself am quite persuaded by those cases where you have radar trackings, and especially when there will be trackings from multiple radar sites of a single object, or a combination of a radar tracking and a visual sighting. I think cases like this, yes, they're anecdotal, but they do provide the kind of evidence that you would have to respect, when you're trying to reconstruct a historical incident. In some ways, and it's invisible, but it won't hurt to make it visible, natural scientists don't get along with historians either. Your garden variety historian may use scientific methods to try to reconstruct a historical event that occurred 500 years ago or whatever, and has very much a scientific mindset and will produce a hypothesis that this is what happened on, and that's not recognized by NASA or SETI or any laboratory scientist either, not because there's anything wrong with the historian, but because the kind of research doesn't rely on empirical evidence that could be re-examined in subsequent experiments. So in some ways, it's a methodological issue that these scientists have a certain method for investigating data, and the UFO investigator is a little bit more like a historian, actually, than a laboratory scientist, and that might have something to do with it. I think another thing, you'd mentioned the ridicule factor. It is the case that the UFO phenomenon gathers a wide spectrum of different people. The nuts and bolts investigators that I just mentioned are the kind of crowd that I hang around with and kind of like, etc. But having spoken at UFO congresses and MUFON meetings, there's a wide variety of people who come up. I mean, who attend, shamans and New Age spirituality practitioners, and I talked to at a most recent meeting to reincarnation counselors, and so there's a wide variety there. And so when you look at the UFO phenomenon from the point of view of a scientist in SETI or NASA, they don't see just the nuts and bolts investigators. They see this whole phenomenon, and they tend to be not very spiritual people. And certainly with regard to spiritual matters, they don't think of it as being very scientific. So I think we have a split in our culture here. I happen to like both groups very much. That's why I use the two barbecue image here. I like going to the barbecues by both groups.
I agree with you there, and this will probably take us into our next break, which will bring us into our next hour, which we have so much more to talk about. But the problem, I think, with scientists is they want to remove everything spiritual out of it. But nonetheless, that actually brings us to our break, and I will pick that up right when we come back. Everybody stay tuned. Third Phase of Moon Radio, right back. And now we welcome you back to Hour 2 of Third Phase of Moon Radio. I'm your host, Dr. J, and like we've had last hour, we have an amazing show again for you this hour. Co-hosting with me today is Madison, and of course we have our producer, Laura. We are speaking to none other than Professor Ted Peters, who is so many things, among them being an astrotheologist, Professor Emeritus from, I believe the school is, where is it? Pacific Lutheran.
Pacific
There we go.
Theological Seminary and Theological Union.
And you've also been NASA. You've also been an advisor to NASA, MUFON director for the state of Louisiana, and so much more. Now, there's so many more questions I have to ask you. And again, I want to plug in your book again, UFOs, God's Chariots, with the question mark, because are they God's chariots? And one of the things I'd like to say is that they are. You know, in the Bible, it is full of UFO sightings and all these angels that they talk about. To me, I think are flesh and blood extraterrestrials. And I wanted to ask you, is that what your take is? Is that what when you started perusing through the Bible and seeing those references to a flying shield with flames on it, or angels coming from the skies above, was your mind thinking that, you know, these could possibly be off-world beings?
Well, there are two meanings for the phrase God's chariots. One is the one that you just enunciated, namely that perhaps reports of angels in ancient Israel, or perhaps the pillar of smoke and the fire by night that Moses followed with the children of Israel leaving Egypt, that perhaps these are phenomena that are the result of flying saucers, and that perhaps our ancient ancestors just simply didn't understand the difference between machines and spiritual phenomena. So that would be one definition. There's a second definition that I like to work on, and it's a little bit more subtle, and it goes like this.
We have an unidentified flying object.
Third Phase of Moon.